Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, The Crafted Studio Company. Today we are going to be doing some cookie decorating with my company Sugar Bee Cookies here in Western Canada. This is a collection of 4 cookies done in a wet-on-wet icing technique, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. But these are part of DIY kits that I'm selling for the holidays and a workshop series that I'm doing here. I have 4 different workshops. This is just the first one. So if you purchased the kit for this or attended my workshop, this is the video of how to do all the cookies. Each kit comes with a little booklet that talks about icing and recipes. It also gives you a step-by-step guide for each and every cookie that we're doing today. So you can watch the video, but then you can keep this on file for later use and refer to it to remind yourself. And both the workshop and the DIY kits get this. If you attend my workshops, you'll also get icing practice sheets that we go over in class, and how to do basics with dots and lines and movement lines and how to outline and flood. And then each and every single workshop theme has its own little specialty add-on practice things. For today, for the video, we are going to just jump into decorating, but first I'll talk about the kit itself and what's all included. If you didn't get a kit, that's not a problem. If you're just watching the video, you can feel free to bake your own cookies and make your own icing. And I'll talk about the icing too here in a moment. Each kit includes 4 icing colors, 2 greens in a couple of different colors, a scribe tool or a needle tool. This is a cookie decorator's best friend. If you don't have one of these, that's not a problem. Just you can use a toothpick, or you can go to a knitting section, say in Walmart, and they have sort of the powder coated metal needles with a fine tip on them. You can get one of those because they can be sterilized. The kits also come with 8 cookies. I'm only showing 4 here because we're doing 4 designs. But you're going to get 2 each of a snowflake, a snow globe, a round, and a tree. If you're making your own cookies at home and you don't have a snow globe, that's not a problem. All you need to do is cut a larger round cookie. And you can just also hand cut a little sort of square rectangular bottom and attach it to the cookie, press it together and bake it, and they'll bake together. You don't have to have this snowflake shape, just any snowflake shape will do, but those are the ones we're working with. So all the kits come with the 4 icing, the needle tool, and 8 cookies. The icing we're working with is a medium consistency. So I'm working with probably about a 12 to 15 second icing. And I'll show you in a moment what that means. And I'll also show you how we cut the bags. Royal icing comes in different consistencies, comes in generally a thick consistency when you first make it off the mixer. I have already added water to this and made it more fluid. And when we're talking about consistencies, what we're talking about is how long it takes to level itself out when it's just at rest, or the thickness of it, the sort of the viscosity. What we're looking for this particular kind of design style with the wet on wet, we want a nice flood consistency where it floods down. I don't know if you can see that, but it floods down nice and flat. It levels itself smooth instead of being lumpy and bumpy. More detailed cookies that have details on top of a base like this, that would have like lettering or greenery, things like that, or sort of like piped flowers, you'll want a stiffer consistency. I will have some more themed tutorials out in the coming weeks that talk about the different consistencies. But for this one, we're working with about a 12 second consistency. You can see that it pours smoothly off my spoon and it starts to level itself out. And if I give it just a little shimmy, shimmy, shimmy shake, it levels itself flat. I have an air bubble. These needle tools are fantastic for all sorts of tips and tricks when you're cookie decorating. But it's really great for manipulating your icing. So a heal time on royal icing is how long the icing takes to heal itself when it's at rest, meaning when we mark it with, mark the surface, how long it takes for that surface to heal itself and become level again. So I'm going to just take the end of my spoon and I'm going to mark that, and I'm counting out in my head. And I'm sitting at about a 12-second consistency. The mark is still there. You might not be able to quite see it in the lighting or on the camera, but with just a little manipulation and a shake, it will fix itself. So that's the perfect consistency. You could work with thinner if you want, a looser flood. It's just a little harder to outline and control for beginners on a cookie without it flooding over the cookie. You could also work with it a little bit thicker, but I wouldn't go too much thicker than this because then it's not going to smooth itself out. So that's what we want for an icing consistency. Now, when you get your bags, we're working with tipless bags. You can get these on Amazon and most places now. If you're working with the tip at home and you're familiar with piping bags, tips, and couplers, then you'll want to work with a #1 tip. What we want to do to cut these bags is take the smallest amount off possible. So I'm going to try and get up close to the camera and hopefully it'll stay in focus. So what I do is I use my fingernail and my finger. I just move some of that icing out of the way and I create just the smallest little area that I can cut off. And it's not quite enough. It's always better to go smaller than it is to go bigger. And you can see my icing. Always keep a damp cloth at hand or a paper towel. You can see my icing flows out smooth. I'm going to try and show you on a surface that gives you, oh, here, I have some parchment. My icing, when I give it a squeeze, flows out smooth. And I can create a nice fine thin line without it breaking. And that's what we're looking for. White probably wasn't the best color to do that with, white on white. I have already cut my other bags. Now, if you did get my kit, you may notice that the icing color is a bit mottled. What that is the moisture separating out from the sugar. So just give the icing a nice massage and just mix that back in. That can just happen when I pre-bag them and they sit for a day or so. Sometimes I pre-do kits and I freeze the icing, so when it thaws, it just needs a little bit of a massage. These bags are already open. Try and do this before you open the bags. If you have already cut your bags, that's fine. Just hold the end and massage it. I'm just going to go through and massage all my bags. And my red is okay. All right. So that is the kit. That is the icing consistency, and that's everything that we're going to be working on today. So let's just get started. We're going to be starting with the wreath cookie first. And in your book, you can follow along if you find it easier to have a sort of a visual step-by-step. I'm going to move some of these other cookies out of the way. Okay. I'm actually working with 2 different sizes here, but that's okay. what we're going to do, we're going to flood our cookie first. So we're going to outline it. And I usually try and outline, you can see I've left a little bit of room. I always try and outline it a little bit on the inside, because when we're doing wet on wet, it can kind of, when you're adding other colors into it, it can spread it out. So what wet on wet icing is when we're putting wet icing colors like the greens and the reds here onto an already existing wet base so that they meld together and become one. Some of you who have bought my kit or were at the workshops may notice that I have done edible marker rings around all the rounds or some of the shapes, just to give you a guide, an edible guide to work on. If you're new to cookie decorating, you can take your cookie cutter and you can use it as a stencil and even scratch the top of the cookie just lightly with your scribe tool to give yourself a bit of a visual guide to pipe on. But I'm just going to go ahead, and all I'm doing is I'm touching the icing to the surface and barely squeezing. And while I continually squeeze, I'm lifting up and letting, that was a mistake. It's hard to do this under the camera and not get in the way of the camera. So the angles are always funny when you're filming. But basically what we're doing, I'm going to just show you with the different color quickly. We are squeezing just a tiny little bit and touching the surface and connecting, and then I'm lifting up and letting the icing fall into place. It seems counterintuitive, but when you let the icing fall into place and you lift up, it actually has a lot more cleanliness to it. It gives you a lot more control, and you can kind of correct as you go what you're doing. So that's all we're going to be doing. Okay, so just make sure I'm in frame here. We're going to be doing lift up, and I'm just following my shape around. It does not have to be perfect. We can correct that in the next steps. All right, and we're going to give that a moment, and then we're going to come in and we're actually going to fill and flood this. So I'm going to work around the edges, squeezing more firmly. And because we're working with this kind of consistency, it will just start melting together. You have to squeeze quite hard, but do not worry about all those bare spots. They are going to fill in together, but we're also going to help it along after. I just want to get the majority of my flood in. And you can kind of go back in and add a little icing, or use the tip of your icing bag to move things around. You can give your cookie a little shake. But this is where that needle tool comes in handy. You're going to take your needle tool, and I'm just using little sort of almost whipping motions. And I'm just fixing all those spots and those edges that maybe weren't so perfect. It's hard to see this under the camera. All right. I'm just going to give it a little shake and a tap. I'm just trying not to shake too much because the camera seems very loose today in its stand. Oh, and try not to touch the icing like I did. And if you do, just go in and stitch it with your needle tool. Just do a little tap tap and stitch down. And we have our flooded base. And it is going to continue leveling itself out if you notice that it is not quite level. If you have particularly thin spots or thick spots, use your needle tool to move that around or add just a little more icing into those spots. It just needs just a little bit more sometimes, but you don't want to go too much. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our lighter green icing. Just going to clean off my tip. And I'm going to squeeze some dots. And I'm just working in the quarter sections at the moment. Like that. I'm going to go in between and squeeze more dots. And you can see I'm doing actually quite thick dots. If you do too small, the pattern's not going to come through. So you want fairly large dots like that. I'm just going to let that kind of sink into the icing, that wet on wet technique. And I'm going to come through and we're going to just drag through the center of every dot all the way around. Do not worry about having to get it perfectly centered. I'm actually going to come through a couple of times and do that. You can see that we created this sort of heart chain effect. The start of our wreath. Now we want different shape greens. So we're going to take our darker green now, and in between each one of those layers, I'm going to create little lines. These don't have to be perfect. This is a very forgiving technique because we're going to be moving the icing around. Anything that's not perfect is going to be moved out of place anyways. And I think I'm actually just going to come in and I'm going to create double lines. You don't have to do this, but this is just going to add a little more extra leafiness. That's these little guys that you see here. And this is where the magic happens. We're going to take our needle tool again. We're going to come around, and I'm going to go around a couple of times. You don't want to go around so much that you start muddying it together. You can kind of come in and create more dots if you want, if you're losing some of the definition, but the more you play with it, the more likely it is going to start blending too much together. I'm just going to lightly, so I'm just kind of barely drawing on the surface with these. And there you have it. You have greenery. Now if you don't like it, that's okay. It's quite common not to like your cookie along the way. Any areas like I can see I don't particularly like these areas, but that's what I'm going to use the berries for. So I'm going to take my red and I'm going to create little berry dots. Now I'm making sure to separate out my dots away from each other because otherwise they're going to bleed together. And I'm just doing groups of 1, 3, and 2. You can do whatever you like. And you can kind of go back in and see if there's any areas that you want to add a little more. That is a wet on wet wreath cookie. And when it dries, it's going to dry a little bit darker. And give yourself a pat on the back, a clapping hand. You did really well. And we let these set aside to dry. You're going to want these to dry for about 6 to 8 hours if possible. You can put them under a fan and help them crust over really quickly. But you're not going to want to stack them or move them much until they're nice and dry. So the next cookie we're going to be working on is our tree. And we're going to just follow the same technique. We're going to outline and flood it, and then we're going to add some color into it. And I'm just going to outline this as best I can under this camera. I would say take your time, but you have to move fairly quickly with the wet on wet. So your outline is fine to take time on, but once you flood it, you're going to want to start doing your detail work right away so that it has time to melt into each other. If the cookie starts crusting over before you put, say, all the green branches on, the branches aren't going to sink into the design. They're going to kind of sit on top and muddle. Now, with shapes like this, you can work around the edge and all the way around and around like we did with the round, but this one I kind of like to do in sections. And you can kind of go back and forth, whatever you're comfortable with. You're going to find your own way of flooding and filling sections. There really truly is no right or wrong. There are some tricks and tips once you get decorating more to make it a little more easy, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to get them flooded. That's number one. You can see any bigger section requires more and more pressure. Okay. Now, if you have a toothpick or another scribe tool, you can actually use one scribe tool to hold or toothpick to hold the cookie instead of putting your fingers around it. I'm just touching to the surface of the cookie without pressing into the cookie itself. All right. Ooh, sorry for the sniffles. I have a slight allergy to icing, believe it or not. It always makes me sniffly. All right, and I'm actually just going to use my scribe tool to shake it. So I'm just grabbing the cookie without pressing into the cookie itself. And you can see that's helping level my icing. And then anywhere that I've left sort of little peaks or bumps, I'm just stitching. And all I mean by that is I'm just sort of tapping it down. Moving the icing to where anywhere that there's a bare spot. Okay, so for this one, we're going to be starting in the bottom section of the tree here with the darker icing. And all I'm doing is finding a point, probably right up into the next section above it. And I'm drawing a line down. And I always start in the middle because then it gives me my guide. And all I'm going to do is draw lines outwards, kind of like a fan. And I'm leaving space in between each one. Now you can start from the bottom up. I'm going to clean my tip as I go. You can start from the bottom up if you find that easier. There's really no right way to do this. It's just a matter of doing it. And then I'm going to move up into the next section, and I'm going to create like a little mark into the section above and come down. And you can overlap. Tree branches are all connecting and overlapping in real life. So, and if you have a broken line like that, don't worry. Just go back in. Or if you have a glob, a particularly globby area, just use your needle tool and quickly just pull out some of the icing or draw through it a little bit. Now I'm going to go up to the next section. Clean my icing tip if you find it's curling or if you're not squeezing consistently. If you're not squeezing with consistent pressure, you'll find that you'll ball up the icing on the tip of your bag. Okay. So while it's still wet with the green, the darker green, we're going to take our lighter green and we're going to go into all those areas as best we can in between and right over top. And this just gives us a little contrast. So that way we get a little of the white, a little of the dark green, and a little of the light green. Here we're going to work through all those sections. And each of these cookies today is really about personal taste. You do not have to follow the directions I'm doing exactly. You just need to follow the technique. So I'm globbing up. You want to make sure that you keep that cloth on hand or a paper towel. If you find doing a little V like I'm doing, you can see I'm going up and down. You can do that. Just as long as you're going in between each branch. All right. And those are going to sink into each other. But what we're going to do is take our needle tool. You can see I'm using a different one. This is my normal one. It's a little longer. The shorter ones are, I find easier for people generally when they're learning, but I like a nice long one. I'm going to just drag up through my cookie, and I'm just dragging through the icing, not on the cookie itself. And I'm pulling that icing up. You might get a peak there, so you can pull that peak off if you want to and stitch it together. And I'm going to do that in a couple of places. I'm going to sweep up towards where the stem, where the trunk would be. And it's just going to help that cookie layer together. And if you get sort of mucky, muddy areas that you find are blending too much together, you can kind of go in with your white just to get a little definition again. You can, if you want a little more darker green, you can go in and put that in. It really is all about your personal preference of what you like. But the more icing you add on, the more likely you are to start flooding and spilling over and pressing the icing out, and you could spill off the edges of your cookie. So quite often keeping it simple is the best way to go, because when we add details like all these little berries and baubles, you're going to be able to hide any of those areas you don't like. So while it's still wet, I'm going to go into some of those areas I don't really like, and I'm going to create little tiny dots. Now these are going to go a long way, so don't make them too big, because you can see they're starting to get bigger. But also you want to make sure you keep them separated so they don't bleed together. And I'm going to create, again, just like my wreath, little areas where I have 2, 1, or 3. All personal choice. You could create little dots in a row if you wanted to create like a garland effect. I'm also going to take my white and create a couple of little white dots. You don't have to do this. This is just a personal preference. I just like filling it out a little bit more. And these ones might not sink in as much because the icing is starting to crust over a little bit. So yeah, I'm just testing it on the edge here, and the icing is crusting over a bit. So it's not going to kind of level itself out anymore. It's just going to start mucking up. That's why we have to work fairly quickly. But there you have it. Now you have a tree cookie. Yay. And we're going to move that to a side. Now you have to be really careful with this. If you have a little spatula, I would suggest that. Okay. The next cookie we're going to work on, we're actually going to work on these back and forth. The snow globe and the snowflake. We're going to start with the snowflake, and what we're going to do is all the sort of the outside snowflake details, and then we're going to let that crust over a bit before we come in and do the center. And while that's doing that, we're going to come in and we're going to do that little red base on the snow globe. And this is just because we're working with sections that we don't want to bleed together. We want to give them time to kind of crust over in between. So I'm going to start with my snowflake here, And I'm just going to create a little guide for myself. You guys probably actually can't see this. It's so light. But you want to make sure you brush off any crumbs. If you have a food paintbrush, you can use that. But all I'm going to do, I'm going to ignore that center section I created a minute ago. And I'm going to come in and just create some sort of a dot and pull like a teardrop. I'm going to create one over here. If your snowflake shape is different, that's okay. You don't even have to do this. You could actually outline the whole thing and then just do a scene on it. This is just a fun way of showing you how to do a cookie shape that is taking one shape and doing something different with it. But for the sake of this kit, this is how I've designed this one. Squeeze, and while I'm squeezing, I'm pulling. Squeeze, pull. But I'm releasing, so I'm getting a nice big teardrop in and I'm pulling. Some of them might look like tadpoles, but you can use the tip of your icing bag to pull it, or you can actually just take your scribe tool and pull the icing down. But we're going to be adding details to this, so don't worry too much. I would say that if you have this kit with this cookie, you want to create a line down the middle, but then you almost want to come sideways off of these ones. So here's the one down the middle. Squeeze, pull. And if you come down below your center, that's fine, where you created a guide or where you're going to flood later. But squeeze on the side, and I'm almost coming sideways instead of coming down. Squeeze, pull. It'll just lend better to this particular shape. Actually, I love this cookie cutter. I have so many snowflake cutters, and I'm still looking for the perfect one. But this one comes close, but it's a pretty large cookie. It doesn't look too large, but I find every time I start flooding it or filling it, I realize how big it is. All right. So we're actually going to leave that. All these other details we're going to do after. We want this to crust over a bit, and then what we're going to do is come in and we're going to flood that center. If you've come down into your section down here, don't worry about that. That's fine, because it's going to get covered over. So we're going to sit him aside, and we're going to come to our snow globe, and we are going to do the red bottom. You can see on this one that I've curved it, but that's okay. You can actually go straight across. And I'll show you, if you have the guide, you'll see. Here I've just suggested a nice simple circle, square, rectangle. So if you're feeling confident, you can kind of round it out if you want to. And you can see I'm doing that outline where I lift away and I'm letting the icing fall into place. If you try and draw, I'm going to do it right in the center. If you try and draw a line right close to the cookie, you can see it starts wonking and it's not consistent. You don't have as much control. When you touch the surface and lift and let the icing drop, you get a much cleaner line. So we're going to go in and we're going to flood and fill this section. I'm going to use my tool. You can turn your cookie as you need to. Some people work on like a turntable. I don't find I need that because quite often I'm working on a surface that I can spin my cookie easily enough. Okay, so while it is wet, we are going to take our white and we're going to create these snowflakes, sort of like that knit sweater, Christmas sweater snowflake. And this is how I do it. I'm going to start in the middle. I always start in the middle of every design generally. Gives you spacing guide. I'm going to just, I'm not even squeezing a dot. I'm barely touching the icing to the red. And it's just going to give me a guide. And I want to create 6 dots around that center point. So like this. And you don't want these too big. I actually go up and down. And then now I know I have space for 2 in the middle. Kind of like a flower. And we're going to come in with our scribe tool right away. And in the center of that dot, I'm going to pull up. And this is where you need your cloth and you will need to wipe your tool almost in between every time. I'm going to take the center of that same dot where I pulled up, and now I'm going to pull down. Right to the center of that whole circle thing. And I'm going to do that all the way around. If you find it easiest to go through and do all the up motions first, that's fine, you can do that. But you want to come back down into the center for each one to create sort of that arm of a snowflake. There you go. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to create just a tiny little dot in the center. But I'm also going to create tiny little dots, and I'm barely squeezing because a little goes a long way with this when you want details. In between each arm, just to give you a little definition. Now, you can do 3 if you want. Now you just work on the other one and then the next one. Or you can do whatever pattern you want. You can do, like for example, if you squeeze some bigger dots, I'm going to squeeze a series of 3 dots like that, and I'm going to let them sit for a minute. It's whatever pattern you want to do. But you could do 3 dots, and then you can take your needle tool and just through the top of each, drag them, and you create almost like a chain of hearts, kind of like the wreath that we did. If you work off the side, that's fine. Just clean it up as best you can. You know, you could add some lines. You can do whatever you want. Just try and keep it simple. And this one I mucked up a bit, so I'm just going to drag through a little bit and pull it down. Same with this one. You can do whatever pattern you want. I like the 3 snowflakes personally, but I wanted to show you something different if you wanted to. We're going to let him set aside until that crusts over just enough that we can come in with the white and it won't bleed together. We're going to come back to our snowflake. Now, if you had done your snowflake where you covered your whole snowflake and flooded it in this next step, that's fine. You can skip this first step. But we're going to come through, and that guide I made earlier, you guys can't see it on camera, but if you made yourself a guide, or just come through and make a round. Oops, I wasn't squeezing consistently. And you're going to take your needle tool and fix any boo-boos as best you can without affecting any icing that's already been down. See, it's very forgiving. You don't have to be perfect. And even my circle's not all that perfect, but that's okay. And you've had to come probably over top of some of the arms that you did. And if you have space in between, don't worry about that because we're going to hide that with dots later. But this is where you can also push out that line a little bit. When you flood it right against the edge, it's actually pushing out that line and giving you more icing to work with to fill it out. Icing all over my fingers. Okay. Just be careful that you're not touching cookie Where's my tool? And this is where I can kind of make my circle a little bit more of a circle. If it's a little bit wonky, I'm just kind of pulling and pushing the icing. If you have enough icing on there, you should be able to do this with ease. If you're finding you have to mucking around too much with your needle tool to fill spots, you need more icing. But you can see I'm pushing that line out just by doing that simple little whipping motion. Now I don't want to play around with this for too long because I need this white icing layer to be nice and fluid for the next step. And I touched my cookie right there. So I don't like it right down here. So I think I'm going to make that my bottom. And we're going to come in with our lighter green, and this is a really fun technique. I'm going to pick a couple of places on my cookie to do some trees. So I'm going to start right here, sort of just off, if I'm looking at the center, just beside the center. But I'm going to come in and just pipe some zigzags back and forth, like that. And you can start from the top if you want to, but you just need to get bigger as you go to the bottom. And you don't have to come right down to the bottom of your cookie. So you can see I didn't here. When you have that zigzag, here's where the magic happens. Is you're going to take your needle tool right through the bottom, up through the top. Try not to drag on the cookie like I did there, because then you leave too much of a gap. That should start blending itself. Just through the top of the icing. Through the top, boom, and you've created a couple of trees. And don't worry if they're not all perfectly straight. I mean, in the woods, they're not straight anyways. They're all bending every which way. So, and you can kind of stitch in if you want to, but it should fill itself in. If you have any peaks, just tap them down. Now we're going to pick a couple of spots to do the dark green, and we're actually going to work right over top. And I'm just zigzagging back and forth. Now keep in mind your tree is going to get bigger, so don't go up too high because you need room to draw and pull that icing up into the white. And I'm going to do just a tiny little one. So you can do very narrow. You can do a very narrow cookie like this, or you can do much wider. You could do your branches, like I did pretty tight zigzags. You could actually do a much looser zigzag and you're going to get a much more loopy style like this. A loopy style branch. There's no right or wrong. And pull up. Wipe off your tip in between and pull up. Tap down any peaks. And you want to leave it. You don't want to play with it too much because the cookie may look a little boring now, but we're going to come in and add some snowflakes and dots when this dries a little bit more and finish it up. And you'll find that that really tightens the whole thing up. So we'll set them aside. And we'll come back to our snow globe. So unlike the first couple of cookies we did, where we could do the whole cookie decorate at one time, more often than not, cookie decorators have to do everything in sections. Wet on wet is usually a more forgiving, where you can kind of do it all at once because you want to work with the wet icing, but often we don't want the wet icing. We want to let any of our sections kind of dry before we move to the next one. Okay, so we're going to come in here. I just dropped a piece of icing on my icing. Be very careful if you have to clean up anything on your wet icing or crusting icing. Sometimes it's better to just wait for it to dry more and then pick it off. Okay, we're going to start right at the base. Oh. Make sure if you have any clogs in your icing bags, sometimes the tiniest little dried piece of sugar in there can create a clog. I pull it out and clean, pull on it and clean it with the wet cloth. And if your icing bag is getting loose, just make sure you push the icing down and give it a twist. You can use those sandwich bag clips or chip bag clips to hold everything in place if you want, or an elastic. Okay, we're going to come in. Now keep in mind, I am doing this under a camera and some equipment, so it's hard for me to see what I'm doing. If you're working right above your cookie, you should have better control. And also, quite often you'll have better control if you hold your wrist or your icing bag with the other bag. Now, if you're feeling particularly confident, you can kind of come in right beside your red and create a line here. This will help get you a better definition, but it's not needed because when we flood, you're going to flood right up to that line anyways. Yeah, see, I can see my line is a little bit wonky here, but I'm going to actually just use my icing bag, squeeze a little bit and push that out and clean up my line. Just a little tip. Okay, so let's flood that. Now, I don't know if some of you can see when I'm getting that sort of bubbling effect in my icing, like it's pushing out. It's because I'm trying to go too close to the cookie and then kind of stomping off the flow. So you'll just find the balance that works best for you. I'm working just above the cookie and letting the icing kind of flow into place as best I can. Now this one is a large cookie. So this is going to take some, if you need to give your wrist a break, just give it a break for a minute. And you can see I'm holding that piping bag and giving myself more control, more stability. A lot of people just want to work like this, and that's fine, but you'll find you'll have less control. Okay. Use your needle tool. Uh-oh. I can see my light is fritzing out a bit. I don't know if that is picking up on camera, but we'll fix it if it goes out. All right. We were talking about consistencies earlier. See, this one is a little thick. You can see it's leaving sort of, it's not smoothing out as quickly as, say, I had in that that sample bowl. So sometimes it's easier to work with just a little bit of a looser consistency, but this one is easily manipulated with just a little shaking. And don't forget, we're putting designs on here, so if it's not perfectly flat, that's fine. Tap down any peaks, and while it is wet, we're going to make those designs, and it's going to be exactly the same as we did with the snowflake scene. We're going to pick a couple of places to put the lighter trees, and the lighter trees are just meant to be that background. So when you're looking at a forest or a picture of the woods, you'll notice all the trees in the background are fading into sort of a mist. That's the effect we want. We're going to come in. This one I want to make nice and tall. So I want him to be about this tall. I'm going to stop short of where I think I'm going to need him. And I'm going to pick one right here. Nice and shorter. And you can make them as tall or wide or as narrow as you want. And then I'm going to come in with my dark, and I'm going to create just a little tiny one here. I'm going to go very narrow, back and forth, and I'm going to make the branches very tight. So my zigzag is very, very tight. And if you want him a little bigger or taller, you just come back in and you just add more. Now you will find your edges are going to crust up faster than your center. So if you can work on your edges first, you'll be happier with your end result. This one I'm going much looser with my branches. You can see my zigzag has more space in between instead of really being tight and compact, because I want some loopy branches. And this one's going to be a more loopy one too. And I'm working right over top and not worrying about layering on top of that other light colored one. And I tap down anywhere I don't like. And that's the snow globe. And we're going to come back in and add some snowflakes after. That's funny. On this one, I just realized that this one has a light green. I don't know if the camera's going to pick that up. A light green snowflake dot. I don't know how I managed that. Okay. I'm going to carefully put him aside. And I'm going to come back to that snowflake because now we can just sort of add those accents and details of additional snowflake dots and stuff. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to just add a nice little simple dot in between each of my snowflake arms, stems, branches. I'm not quite sure what they'd be called. And I can see I actually mucked that one up a bit, so I'm just going to pull that off. And then I think I'm going to add a dot at the base of the trio, sort of above, right at the base of my flooded section, just to hide any of those edges I don't like. Give something the eye to see. And I have quite a bit more space in here, so I'm actually going to just add these extra little dots on the side of each of one of my snowflake. And again, this is personal style. You can add as little or as much as you want to each one. I'm going to leave it there. But I'm going to go through, and now this should be crusted, and I'm actually just going to pipe some varied sized dots, more in the upper blank space to give the illusion that it's snowing. I'm going to do a couple of bigger ones, and I'm kind of scattering them around, and then you can do a couple just on top of the trees just to give that illusion, but you don't want to cover up your trees. And then I'm going to go through with a bunch of tiny little, where I'm barely squeezing. I'm just squeezing now to get that little ball on the end and touching it to the surface. And that's how you get all those tiny little ones. If they peek up, that's okay. They should settle down. You can go through and make a couple bigger if you want to. And voila! Snowflake scene. And hopefully we've given our snow globe a little time to crust over. I'm working a little fast here for the sake of the video, so by the time you get to this should be fine. You want to make sure that it crusts over, and we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to go in to a few places that I see I don't like how my icing is sitting, and I'm going to hide those spots with some bigger dots. I'm going to do a couple on the trees just to give the illusion of snow, and then around those bigger ones I'm going to go through and make a couple of varied size clusters. And try not to do this too much so I don't get in the way of showing you the cookie, but it's hard not to guide my hand. Now, your hand is going to be covered in icing, so make sure you wipe it off every once in a while, because that dried icing on your hand is going to fall onto your cookie, and you don't want that. If you had some of those sprinkle cookies that look like snowflakes, that'd be really cute to add a couple on there. But guys, that is a complete set of wet on wet cookies. I'm trying not to move these around too much because they're still wet. But you can see when you bring the whole collection together, it's just beautiful. So you might not like an individual cookie, But without fussing with it too much, I usually recommend just wait and see how it looks with your whole collection, because some cookies need to be more simple and some cookies need to be more featured and detailed in order for a collection to really pull together. But that is the wet on wet royal icing technique. So I hope you have fun. I hope you try this at home. And if you bought one of my kits and tutorials, I really appreciate it and I thank you. Hope you guys have all a beautiful day. Cheers.